So before we begin, I just want to give a land acknowledgement. I am based in Toronto, and the Lincoln Alexander School of Law is based in downtown Toronto. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us. So I am a professor at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law at Ryerson University, and this is an event that we are co-hosting with Ottawa U's Faculty of Law. And today we are going to be talking about assisted reproductive technologies in the context of COVID-19. So there are a wide variety of barriers, legal, ethical, economic, geographic, that limit access to assisted reproductive technologies, or ARTs, technologies that are used to enhance pregnancy. All of these issues have been further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and related restrictions and barriers and delays. Things like pauses on non-essential medical procedures, border closures, and staffing shortages have all affected access to these technologies. So today we are going to explore a variety of them. We have a really great panel lined up for you. So we are going to go through them. I'm going to introduce them one by one, and we will hopefully have some time to have discussion at the end. So we are going to explore questions about what opportunities or barriers to ARTs have arisen or been exacerbated by the pandemic. We're also going to talk about how law and policymakers should consider these concerns in their responses to the current and also future pandemics. So I'm going to start with our first speaker, Srishti Hukku, and she is a PhD candidate in population health at the University of Ottawa and in medical anthropology at Macquarie University in Australia. Srishti's research interests include the sexual and reproductive health spectrum with a special focus on abortion, the role of disruptive technologies in reproductive health, reproductive autonomy, and assisted human reproduction. Outside of academia, Srishti is a two-time recipient of the Canadian Public Service Award of Excellence, the highest recognition given to a public servant in Canada for innovation and exceptional leadership. So I am going to pass the floor over to Srishti, who is going to be speaking about artificial womb technology. So over to you, Srishti.
That's great. I just want to check in to see if you can all see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Katie. So as Katie mentioned, my name is Srishti Hukku, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here today to be talking to you about assisted reproductive technologies, not only in the context of COVID-19, but expanding hopefully our minds to paradigms beyond this time period that we're in. I wanted to extend a big thank you to everyone who's joining us. I know my lab is present, so really appreciate all of you being here wherever you're joining us from. And I wanted to extend a warm thanks to both Katie and Pascal for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I want to express my gratitude also for the opportunity to study, learn, and join you from the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, also known as Ottawa, Canada. And of course, I'd like to thank the Center for Health Law Policy and Ethics for a scholarship that really made all of this possible. It allowed me to participate in a summer institute with leading scholars discussing the impacts of COVID-19. Instead of pronouns, I invite you to use my name to address me. And similarly, I will try to be as inclusive as possible in the language that I use, recognizing that unfortunately, a lot of the time, we're dealing with binary data when it comes to sexual and reproductive health. Of course, standard disclaimer, any perspectives that I share here today are my own and do not reflect the views of any organization with which I may be affiliated. So let's get started. So why are we talking about this today? from my perspective, with Zero Discrimination Day, International Women's Day, and the Transgender Day of Visibility all happening in March, there could be no better time to have this conversation on the future of assisted reproductive technologies. Over the last few years, we have seen not only the destructive impacts of COVID-19, but I believe that our communal consciousness has really been expanded with regards to systemic oppression, discrimination, and both inequalities and inequities that exist through a range of events such as the killing of George Floyd, the attack on Capitol Hill, the Freedom Convoy protests, which were a little too close to home, and the war currently taking place in Ukraine, just to name a few. I make note of all of these events in an effort to really recognize that legal and policy priorities are not established in a vacuum. And similarly, our ethical frameworks continue to evolve as we're confronted with new challenges and have opportunities to reflect, unlearn, and create more inclusive systems. As an interdisciplinary researcher with a background in population health, anthropology, and public policy, I spend a lot of my time navigating between different conceptual frameworks, assumptions, and ways of thinking about complex issues, or wicked problems, as we call them in the policy world. So as part of my remarks today, I'd like to do something a little bit different. I know I can't see all of you in the audience. I'm going to trust you to join me if you feel comfortable to do so. But I'd like to invite all of you, including my fellow panelists, to try this little mental exercise with me. So if you feel comfortable, I invite you to clear your mind and close your eyes for a second. Now, with a blank slate, I'd invite you to actually picture a family. What do you imagine? Take a mental picture of that for me, and you can open your eyes again now if you had them closed. And if you have a piece of paper, feel free to, draw a picture of what you saw in your mind's eye. Or if your artistic skills are as limited as mine, just jot down a few notes about the things that you saw, any characteristics and images that you saw in your mind. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Great. So, did you imagine a nuclear family? A mother, a father, 2 kids? I was shocked that this image was something along the lines of what I imagined. Did your version of a family have specific demographic characteristics like age or race or sexuality? Did you make assumptions about how they became a family? I'd like you to hold on to that feeling. And as we move through my presentation, I'd invite you to think about how some of these unconscious beliefs might be influencing the way that laws and policies are made with respect to assisted reproductive technologies. So while you ponder that a little bit, let me paint a slightly different picture for you of what's happening with family formation in Canada and abroad. As for the most recent census data in Canada, there were almost 1.5 million lone parent families, also known as single parent families. The same data set shows us that 1 million people identified as part of LGBTQ+ communities in Canada. And almost a third of these are under the age of 25, which means that their reproductive futures and interactions with reproductive technologies lays far ahead of them. You might be surprised to know that around the world, 1 in 4,500 people with double X chromosomes are diagnosed with a condition called MRKH that leads to the absence or underdevelopment of the uterus and other organs. Similarly, physical infertility, that's infertility caused by physiology rather than social positions, such as sexuality, or relationship status, impacts roughly 16%, or 1 in 6 couples in Canada. This number has roughly doubled since the 1980s. In 2020 alone, in Canada, there were over 28,000 premature births. That's approximately 8% of all live births in the country. Even more shocking, around the world, every year, an estimated 15 million babies are born preterm. And this number seems to keep rising. And lastly, at the same time, we know that maternal mortality is a serious issue. Approximately 810 women die from preventable causes every day related to pregnancy and childbirth around the world. That's almost 300,000 women a year. And the stark reality is almost 50 women by the end of this panel alone. Recent data also shows us that nearly 1 in 5 Canadians up to age 49 wanted to delay having children because of COVID-19. At the same time, we know, as Katie mentioned, that COVID-19 resulted in challenges from closures to fertility clinics to an inability to cross the border. So more specifically, this in some cases meant that people lost their last opportunity to have biologically related children. Recent data also suggests that once fertility services reopened after the initial round of COVID-related closures, many people reevaluated their priorities and have undergone fertility treatment during the pandemic. At the same time, conversations on sexual and reproductive health are really evolving. They've evolved from a purely rights-based approach to one that focuses on a reproductive justice lens. Originating from Black feminist thought, one key component of the RJ framework really emphasizes that it is a human right to choose to have children or choose to not have children. So you're probably wondering, okay, Srishti, why is any of this important? Well, from my perspective, we need to recognize that things have evolved significantly over the last 45 years since the birth of Louise Brown, pictured here, who was the first baby born as a result of in vitro fertilization. And perhaps even our definitions have become outdated. According to the National Institute of Health, which is the leading body of health in the United States, assisted reproductive technologies are treatments and procedures that aim to achieve pregnancy. Do you think that there might be anything problematic with that? From my perspective, perhaps pregnancy is actually just an output. And what makes arts really special is that they are, in fact, key to family formation. So maybe they're family formation technologies. And so if the nature of reproductive technologies and family is evolving, perhaps we need to pause and ask ourselves whether existing legislative, policy, and ethical frameworks are evolving at a sufficient pace. And so this is where my area of specialization really lies. I have spent the last 5 years thinking about these issues, and what I wanted to do with my doctoral work was really explore further whether there were any disruptive technologies on the horizon that could shift the current paradigm that we have with regards to assisted reproductive technologies. And of course, someone has already thought of it. And so that's when I came across the individual by the name of JBS Haldane and the concept of ectogenesis, or gestation of humans outside of the human body. I know that's a really out there concept, so take a second to let that sink in. Ectogenesis is generally attributed to Haldane, who was an Indian British researcher who gave a lecture to the Heretic Society at Cambridge University, an intellectual club back in 1923. So Haldane made some predictions that the first ectogenetic child would be born in 1951 and that ectogenesis would eventually become universal, as you can see in the quote here. Although from a technological perspective, we haven't realized Haldane's vision, efforts continue all around the world to reproduce reproduction as you have it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at with that. So before delving further into the story of artificial wombs, I just want to take a second to clarify some key terms to make hopefully this presentation a bit more clear. So ectogenesis, as I mentioned, is a process of complete gestation outside of the human body. So that's from day one, when the embryo and the sperm meet, all the way to the end of a human gestation cycle, which is generally 40 weeks. Partial ectogenesis, on the other hand, is a process of partial gestation within the human body in conjunction with gestation outside of the human body. So we can actually think about technologies that already exist in this space, such as the incubators that you would see in the NICU to help with premature birth. And then artificial wombs are the enabling technology. So where ectogenesis is the process, artificial wombs or artificial uteruses or artificial placenta, there's lots of debate in the community about what language to use, they are the enabling technology for ecto. Okay, so now that we've talked about that, let's fast forward 93 years to 2016. Dr. Alan Flake, a fetal surgeon at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, led a team of researchers that successfully enabled partial ectogenesis through an artificial womb-like structure that they termed the biobag. 8 preterm lambs were extracted from a pregnant sheep between 105 and 120 days in terms of gestational age. They were extracted at this point because this was to mimic a 22 to 24-year-old premature human baby. These lambs, after extraction, were placed in the biobag, as you can see in the image here, and then eventually they completed their gestation cycle within the biobag. A number of tests were conducted during this process, and after birth, with respect to lung maturation, brain growth, and sleep-wake cycles, all of the lambs showed that they were within normal range in comparison to lambs gestated through traditional pregnancy. This milestone is huge and represents the most advanced extracorporeal system developed to date. A few years later, in 2019, Dr. Van de Vos, a professor of cardiovascular biomechanics, and Dr. Guide Oey, the head of perinatal issues, and their respective teams were actually awarded 2.9 million euros as part of the Future and Emerging Technologies grant. This grant falls under Horizon 2020, which is a European program aimed at securing Europe's global competitiveness. So these researchers have since launched an independent organization called Juno and are aiming to develop an artificial womb prototype that would enable premature human babies to be grown in, to complete their gestational process in the biobag or a similar structure rather than in a traditional incubator, to be ready in the next 5 to 10 years for human clinical trials. But that's only a partial story of partial ectogenesis. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, all the while these developments were happening, scientists in parallel were working on the other end of the spectrum on keeping human embryos alive outside of the human body. So previously reaching milestones of 9, 10, 11 days, 2 different groups were actually able to successfully maintain a human embryo outside of the human body for 13 days. The embryos were terminated at that point, not due to scientific limitations, but due to legislative policy and conventional limits on embryo research. So I know that's a lot of information to take in. So I just want to show you this chart, which is what I like to call it gestational gap analysis, and just make sure that we're all on the same page. So from day 1 to week 40 is the average gestational process, as you can see on this chart. Day 1 is when the embryo and the sperm meet. The ovum and the sperm meet to form an embryo, and embryo research has been successful in maintaining these embryos up to day 13. Current legislative limits exist all over the world at around day 14. The scientists in the stem cell research community have suggested that this legislative limit be changed to 28 days. On the other hand, we have partial ectogenesis. So we have scientists that are working on prematurity, and they are working on finding a basically incubator 2.0 for premature human babies born beyond 21 weeks. So 21 weeks is the youngest premature baby to have survived being so premature. All right. I hope that's helpful and that helps you sort of think through what we're talking about. So right now there's a gap between essentially day 13 and somewhere around the week, 21, week 25. So that's where my study comes in. Recognizing this gap, I launched a multinational study under the supervision of Dr. Foster and Dr. Wynn in both Canada and Australia in the fall of 2020, right in the middle of the global pandemic. Although I would have really liked to travel and spend time with the researchers who were working on these studies, I was unable to do so. So my research used online methods to investigate citizens' knowledge of and attitudes towards ectogenesis. Over approximately a 6-month period, I managed to recruit about 526 Canadian and Australian citizens to participate in the first component, which was an online survey, qualitative survey, I should add. And then subsequently, I conducted 2 types of semi-structured interviews. So I did 61 with a subset of participants from the survey, and then 16 with key informants or people who are considered experts in their fields with regards to law, sexual and reproductive health, emerging technologies, etc. So I've identified a number of different themes from the data, but I'm cognizant of time. So I just want to run you through a few highlights. So one of the things that I found really interesting that came out from my research is that 55.1% of survey participants in both Canada and Australia indicated that they felt that artificial womb technology should be developed and or used to help society address reproductive challenges associated with communicable diseases such as COVID-19. Of course, communicable diseases aren't limited to COVID-19, so things like tuberculosis, malaria, etc., are also Zika have impacts on pregnancy. Similarly, over 68% of Canadian and Australian survey participants indicated that they felt that artificial womb technology was innovative. I think these are really important things to keep in mind for policy and legal frameworks that we consider beyond this pandemic. Similarly, most interview participants felt that artificial womb technology could really aid people who were struggling with physical infertility issues, as you can see in this quote today. On the other hand, they were also supportive of artificial womb technology being used in instances of premature birth. So this is not to say everyone was positive, but the vast majority of folks were. And so when we talked about artificial womb technology and premature birth, the technology was categorized as a compassionate technology or a life-saving technology, which is really interesting. On the other hand, there were definitely mixed responses that came through when artificial womb technology enhanced choice for folks more generally. So for example, if people wanted to use artificial womb technology for cosmetic reasons, not everyone agreed that this was something that should be available, let alone something that should be subsidized by the state. As such, we can see that there are really some implicit biases that exist with respect to who deserves to reproduce and who deserves state assistance as part of family formation. So in closing, I think I'm going to leave you with perhaps more questions than answers, given the complexity of artificial womb technology and assisted reproductive technologies more broadly. But as we think about the policy, legal, and ethical issues as they relate to artificial wombs specifically, I'd invite you to consider a few different questions. So what is the policy problem at hand? Is it how do we facilitate family formation? Is it how do we decrease maternal mortality? Is it how do we populate other planets, which is something that Elon Musk is really keen on with artificial wombs? Or is it how do we address a declining fertility rate and a possible population cliff that is predicted for 2100? In terms of the law, I think we need to think about a number of things. So how will artificial womb technology impact existing legislative limits when it comes to things like abortion, adoption, contraception, premature birth, surrogacy, and a whole host of other reproductive technologies that could be used in conjunction with artificial wombs? And then lastly, in terms of ethics, what frameworks are really determining what is ethical behavior? Are we asking ourselves who has a right to form a family? Who has a right to subsidies? When does life begin? What is the role of science and technology in society? And fundamentally, is nature or natural an important way of deciding how to do policy? Or excuse me, how to do ethical decision making. So I would like to bring you back to basically where we started and close with one final question and imaginary scenario. Imagine that you're behind a veil of ignorance. What does that mean? That means you don't know your gender, your sex, your sexuality. You don't know your fertility status, nor do you know your race, class, location, financial status, or any other social positioning. If I were to ask you whether you would prefer to be born in society A, where people with uteruses bear all of the risks and burdens associated with gestation, as we do today, or society B, where ectogenesis has been perfected and is used routinely, which would you choose? Thank you again for your time, and thank you again for having me on the panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and answering your questions at the end of this session.
Thanks so much, Srishti, for walking us through artificial womb technology and ectogenesis and thinking about these broader policy questions, especially in light of COVID-19. I'm sure there will be lots of questions for you on this. I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, who is Alison Motluk. So Alison is a freelance journalist based in Toronto. She writes mostly about assisted reproduction and publishes a weekly newsletter called HeyReprotech. For those of you who don't know it, I highly suggest checking it out. It's a wonderful newsletter. It's where I learn a lot of the new developments in this area. Her work has appeared in The Walrus, in Maisonneuve, Toronto Life, The Economist, New Scientist, various newspapers, and on CBC radio. So I will pass the floor over to Alison.
Hello. Thank you. I'm on, right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. This is an area I spend most of my every day and every week in, and surrogacy, which is what I'm going to talk about, how COVID affected surrogacy and international surrogacy in particular is an area that I'm really interested in. So I don't have any slides because I'm not very technologically advanced, but I'm going to every so often ask you to imagine a slide and I'm going to describe something to you. So I think when people think about COVID-19 and its effect on international surrogacy. My guess is that the image that comes to mind, and here's where you have to imagine the slide, is that room in Ukraine where we saw 50 babies in little bassinets, and we were told that these are the babies that were born to Ukrainian surrogates and whose parents were not able, because of the pandemic, to get to them. So in the meantime, for I don't remember how long, weeks, months, they were being cared for in this large dormitory by hired nannies. And I think that is the number one image maybe that a lot of people have of what happened during the pandemic to international surrogacy. There are also headlines like, I think this would also come to mind, and I'm going to read one again. If I knew how to do it, I'd show you the exact news article. It was in The Guardian or in one of the UK papers. Parents are hiring jets to see their surrogate children for the first time. So this was, I think, in May of 2020, when parents were not able, for whatever reason, to get into the country, and they finally got together and they hired their own jet to go in, see their babies, and bring their babies home. Or this headline, surrogates left holding the baby as coronavirus rules strand parents. And that was a headline from the US. It was a US surrogate who, one of many US surrogates who had acted as a surrogate for a Chinese family. The Chinese family was not able to come over to the US to pick up their child. And so several months, I think, went by. And suddenly the surrogate, who'd really only committed to gestating the child, was now its caregiver after birth. So I think the overwhelming feeling about the pandemic was babies stranded, parents unable to get to babies, surrogates being kind of forced to look after babies. And overall, it was just considered a real mess. And, you know, I think all of those things were true. They happened, but it wasn't the entire truth. And so I'm going to be talking about a sort of a different thing that happened here in Canada. Although I will admit that at the time, like in the spring of 2020, I was among the people asking the question, is this sort of the beginning of the end of international surrogacy, at least for a few years? Because I think that the concerns were so significant, you know, that the problems were suddenly so obvious with international surrogacy. And the answer to that question is no, that was not the beginning of the end, and it was not the nail in the coffin, and it was far from that. So even Ukraine rebounded, even after all of those images of the babies stranded there with the nannies. Ukraine came back as a major center for international surrogacy, to the point where it is now in a brand new crisis, which is, in the slide you can imagine now, is surrogate babies trapped in bomb shelters by the war. So it's right back up to the same old numbers. We're still in a global pandemic. And so the answer is no, it was not the end of international surrogacy by any stretch. International surrogacy is alive and well. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about Canada. Canada is one of a small number of countries in the world that allows international surrogacy. And by that, I mean parents can come from outside the country, work with a surrogate domestically, and then take their child home. There aren't many countries. Among the countries that allow this, there are some states in the US, Mexico, Ukraine, Georgia, Greece, Colombia, Canada, and maybe there's one or two more, but those are the main ones right now. They all have different rules. Ukraine, for instance, only allows heterosexual married people. Other places only allow other kinds of parents. Canada is, I think it's fair to say, a hub for international surrogacy. It's hard to know exactly how many people come here each year, but I think it's safe to say there are hundreds. And that's been true for some years now. We allow single people, married people, straight people, gay people. The only thing we don't allow is our law does not allow payment for surrogacy. So it's a non-commercial international surrogacy, although I think we know that there are, payment happens all the time. It's routine, often covert. That's something I've been very interested in, but I'm not going to discuss it now. Just let it be said that although we are known as a non-commercial, I'm not sure that's exactly the case. So I'd like to take you just to introduce this by talking about a family I interviewed early in the pandemic. They are Australian, Joe and Valeria. They had a 6-year-old, and they were doing surrogacy here in Canada. Their baby was due April 16th, 2020. And their plan was to come to Canada with plenty of time to spare on March 24th. But as all of the advisories and restrictions were announced, if you're like me, you remember that week where it seemed like every day something new was being announced, they decided to move their travel forward as close as possible. And they managed to get a flight to arrive in Canada on March 18th. But it turns out that was in fact the day that Canada closed its borders to foreigners. So this family flew from Sydney all the way to Houston, Texas. And in Houston, they were trying to board their plane and were informed, we're really sorry, but you can't board this plane, you can't go in. So they were not allowed to board their connecting flight. I ended up speaking to them, I think it was that night, from their hotel in Houston. And they didn't know what they were going to do. Were they going to, they said maybe they'll rent a car and drive up. I mean, it's a long way. Maybe they'll fly up and try to get across by taxi or try to get across by foot. They didn't know. But I believe it was the day or maybe 1 or 2 days later, they did fly to Detroit. They took a taxi to the border. They spoke to the border guards, and the border guards said, no, we can't let you in. Among the reasons, of course, was, the virus, but also there at that point were no flights home to Australia in the near future. All Australian airlines were no longer flying. So they pleaded through the car window, please, we have a baby about to be born. And somehow they managed to just get into that little office, where you get to talk to people standing up by a counter. And they managed to get them to agree to at least let their surrogate come and argue their case as well. So the pregnant surrogate, drove several hours down to the border and argued their case for them, said, I'm pregnant, it's their baby, not my baby, here's the documentation. And somehow they did get in. They managed to get in, they came in, they quarantined, and they were here and out of quarantine by the time their daughter was born. And everything went fine, and eventually they went home to Australia, and that was a happy story. Same time, same week, same day, in fact, some other families trying to come into Canada were stranded. There was a family stranded in Japan en route. There were Spanish families who were not allowed by their own government to leave Spain. There was an Israeli dad who got in, a French dad who got in. Some of them flew in and weren't kept at the border. But there was a lot of confusion. And I think that the industry knew, they knew there were about 50 other families for whom this was all going to happen in the next weeks or months. And they were worried about what that would mean. In addition to that, once these families were here, their children were born, they needed to get documentation for these children or they wouldn't be able to get home. So they typically need a birth certificate and then they need a passport. But you can remember, people suddenly were working at home. How does the passport get made and so on? So that was another additional layer of complication that people in the industry knew. This is something that, this is very disruptive. But the truth is, this chaos was extremely short-lived. Before the end of March 2020, all of this had largely been sorted out. So by the end of March, intended parents were coming into the country, and certainly through April and May, without a lot of trouble. They were collecting their babies, they were getting their documents, and they were going home. And Canada looked pretty good. Pretty organized, pretty together. the thing that, so I mean, and I will say this was because the industry got its act together and lobbied very hard for a couple of changes to the law that maybe the rest of us weren't aware of, but were very, very instrumental in smoothing this process for people coming here for international surrogacy. So there was a prohibition on foreign nationals entering the country. But there was an exemption for immediate family members. So the industry, the people involved in surrogacy, international surrogacy in Canada, and I would say led by Toronto fertility lawyer Cindy Wasser, they lobbied to change the rules. And one of the first things that changed was that it was acknowledged that families who were coming here to pick up their second surrogate child had a nice little way in, because the first child, if they'd had a first child here through surrogacy, that first child was, of course, a Canadian citizen. And so those parents were able to argue that although they were foreign nationals, that their child was Canadian, and they had to accompany that Canadian citizen minor who was re-entering the country in order to be reunified with this next member of the family, which was about to be born, who was about to be born. So another thing that happened was that the idea of reunification of families was slightly amended. So my understanding is that it didn't always include parents. And I hear that that's because Canada was careful, didn't want a lot of, in the before times, before the pandemic, didn't want a lot of people coming in, you know, their parents, 90-year-old parents with a host of health problems, just being able to come in, no questions asked. But during the pandemic, the idea of that parents were allowed to come in so long as it was essential travel. Another amendment was that the definition of a dependent child changed. A line was put in so that it explicitly included children born through assisted reproductive technologies. That was now written in, that in addition to the other definitions of what a dependent child might be, someone born through the application of assisted human reproduction technologies was included. And what the lawyers were arguing, of course, is that these children being born through surrogacy were Canadian babies whose parents just happened to live abroad. The parents had to be able to come in. And very soon they had a formal process. They were able to apply for a letter, so that the legislation said that people, if they were authorized in writing by an officer designated under a certain subsection of the Immigration Act or by a consular official of the Government of Canada, they could enter Canada for the purpose of reuniting immediate family members. And that is what they used. So they applied through that, they got that letter, and they carried that letter to, as they boarded their plane, they showed the letter, and as they entered the country, they showed that letter, and they had this letter authorizing them for family reunification purposes to come into the country. My understanding is that they had an email address at Immigration Canada. It was very streamlined. They would apply for this authorization letter. They had to send things like passport photos, their itinerary, a letter from the surrogate's doctor or midwife confirming that she's pregnant and what the due date was, a letter from the clinic saying, yes, in fact, this is a surrogacy, and of course, a covering letter from the lawyer, a little package there. And once that was sent to this office, there was a very quick turnaround and they would get these letters back. I mean, it costs money, right? But it was doable. So that they were able to enter the country, be here for the birth, and then they had an equally streamlined approach to getting people back out of the country. They had a system for registering the birth very quickly. They had a direct phone line to Passport Canada. So if you were an intended parent from another country, you'd be given this after you got your birth certificate. Someone would hand you this phone number. You'd call Passport Canada. Apparently Passport Canada was willing to create these private appointments so that, you were worried. There was pre-vaccine, of course, and your newborn child, you would go in on your own, your family with your newborn, and you would do the paperwork. And apparently there were, passports could be provided within days, or in some cases, many cases, within hours. so that you could then, as an intended parent, book your flight. Well, actually, to get that passport, you had to have your flight booked, but you could be sure you would be able to make that flight, and you would go home with your baby and all your documentation in place. So I remember I interviewed Cindy Wasser at the end of May 2020. And I was curious, what's happening to surrogacy now? I mean, I know you have all these parents that terrific, like you can, because their babies are being born, you can bring them in and they can, be with their children as newborns and they can leave safely and so on. But what's happening to the business in general with this pandemic? And she told me that in a typical year, she might have 400 international surrogacies. But that year, so that was May 2020, she already had 400 by May lined up. And she said there was no slowdown in new consultations. And the thinking was that this was because Canada was, the government response was so swift and so clearly, so it was effective and working, that many people were actually turning to Canada for surrogacy. So I'm just going to pause and say, just remind everyone, because it is hard to keep it all straight, but so this is, May or so 2020, the context, I had a child in high school at the time, school was closed still. Surgeries were being postponed. So, I have a friend who was supposed to have heart surgery in March. It hadn't yet happened. I know from people I follow on Twitter that parents who had children in residential care for psychological or developmental reasons were not yet allowed in-person visits of any kind. So that's just the context of where Ontario was at that point. So let's fast forward a tiny bit, a few months to October, November 2020. And apparently there were more exemptions possible by that time. So people were coming in and leaving smoothly as before, but now apparently there were other exemptions that people were asking for across the board, not just with surrogacy, to be able to support someone going through a medical procedure. If you can imagine, this was, pandemic was dragging on, your parents, maybe your siblings might need some help, whatever. So there were increasingly compassionate health-related reasons that you could now enter the country and help someone. And this was also, intended parents were also given these exemptions from, apparently, what I'm told is that they were allowed to, if they applied, they could come to support their surrogate during a transfer, an embryo transfer, or they could come in to support their donor during their egg donor during an egg donation procedure. And while they were here doing that, at least during the donation, they might also be able to provide a sperm sample in person as opposed to having to ship it. And again, I'll just go back to the context. So this was in the fall of that first year, and I think here in Toronto anyway, high schools were kind of doing a few hours a week, sort of partial, this weird hybrid where you were doing, I think they had, 2 courses per 2 months and then they'd switch. I know that there were no visitors allowed in certain hospitals. Certainly in the Ottawa hospital, there was no visitation. You were allowed to get in as an emergency caregiver, but not there were no visitors, and the staff, it was very short-staffed. And I also remember that in Toronto, and we are the assisted reproduction hub of the province, from November on, the situation was such that we weren't allowed to go inside stores, right? Except for a grocery store or a pharmacy. All stores were closed for about a month and a half or 2 months. I remember because, it was around Christmas time and there was no opportunity to go into stores. So I guess what I find so interesting, overall, I'm going to say that it's possible that the pandemic, contrary to what we think about what happened during the pandemic and international surrogacy, I think where Canada's case is concerned, it's possible that the pandemic actually gave a huge boost to Canada's reputation as an international surrogacy destination. There were no barriers entering the country after they sorted that out. There were apparently no limits on surrogacies or pregnancies that were allowed to be initiated. And again, this is, despite late in the autumn of the first year, rising hospitalizations, very reliable documentation. There were no barriers to exiting the country. So, I would wonder, this was a boon maybe to the Canadian international surrogacy industry. And the reason I'm so interested to share that with you is that I was surprised by that. I found that very surprising, and I think it's really interesting. And I'm going to leave my talk there because I'm interested in hearing what other people have to say about that kind of thing. Any questions or what conclusions you might have about what that might mean, and whether we did the right thing and did the exemplary thing, or whether there's some problem with what we did. Very interested to hear. Anyway, thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Alison. So for those of you who are starting to have questions coming to mind, just remember that we will have time at the end where you can submit those via the Q&A function. So please do start thinking of those and prepping yourself to put them in there so that the speakers have the chance to answer those. We're now going to turn to our third panelist, Amarpreet Kaur. Amarpreet is going to be speaking about germline editing technologies. Amarpreet is a lecturer in health technologies and governance in the School of Social Policy at the University of Birmingham. She is also completing her PhD at the University of Cambridge with the Sociology of Reproduction Research Group, also called ReproSoc, where her research is focused on human germline genome editing as a potential reproductive choice in the UK in relation to disease. Her wider research interests are in emerging biotechnologies and in genomics. So I'm going to now pass the floor over to Amarpreet.
Thank you for the introduction, Katie. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, as mentioned, my PhD research focused on human germline genome editing as a reproductive choice in the UK. So I'll be sharing some research and thoughts on how COVID has impacted the development and access of human germline genome editing. And I say that in the loosest terms because unlike surrogacy and uterine transplants, it's not legal yet for use anywhere. And I'll be sharing how we can use our experiences of our responses to the COVID pandemic to assist planning our responses to future pandemics, as much as we shall hope that we don't actually have another one. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the technology, genome editing, genome simply meaning all the genes that are in an organism, i.e. that make up our DNA, is a technique through which specific parts of DNA can be added, removed, or replaced. There are two types of genome editing, somatic and germline. Somatic editing is done on any other cell that is not a reproductive cell, i.e. not an egg or sperm, and is currently legal in several countries, including the UK. In Canada, there is currently no regulations or guidelines that are particular to that use. And then there's germline genome editing, which is basically edits to gametes or human embryos, i.e. cells that are heritable. And this is in its infancy across the globe, but it's thought to be on horizon, and before the pandemic was in quite prominent discussion. So before the pandemic, towards the end of 2018, human germline genome editing had reached a point where it had been used on the embryo of twin girls. And those twin girls were later named Lulu and Nana, albeit the technology wasn't successful in actually preventing the disease, which was HIV at the time. So this news broke on the eve of an international summit on human genome editing that was being hosted in Hong Kong at the time. And as you can imagine, such monumental albeit unexpected news, sort of overshadowed everything else that was planned for discussion at the summit. And the summit was flooded with a media frenzy, wanting to know what this news meant for science and humanity. I was actually there at the summit, and if you imagine a massive lecture hall, the whole right side was filled with media, to the point where we had to have security manage them as well. So in the aftermath of that news, by early 2019, 2 international initiatives had been set up. The first was the International Committee on Clinical Use of Human Genome Genome Editing, which was convened by the UK's Royal Society, which is a scientific society, and the US National Academies of Science and Medicine. And they were the same people that organised the summit. And the second initiative, that was led by the World Health Organization, and that was an expert advisory committee on developing standards for governance and oversight of human genome editing. And I think the long-winded title there of the committee speaks for itself in terms of what it aimed to do. Both of those initiatives were meant to publish reports in early 2020, but due to the pandemic, those were delayed. The reports were consequently respectively published in September 2020 and July 2021, and are available online should anybody be interested in reading them. So before the pandemic, in light of the birth of Lulu and Nana, many countries across the globe were discussing their legislative stance on human germline genome editing. And we don't have the time to really cover every country's stance. So today I'll only mention legislation in Canada and in the UK, most because this panel's been hosted in Canada, but because my research is based in the UK. So human germline genome editing is currently explicitly illegal in Canada under the Assisted Human Reproduction Act 2004, and is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And in the UK, it's intended to be prohibited under the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act 2008 as amended. And I say intended because due to the wording in the Act and scientific and social advances, there are now scenarios where actually no prohibitions exist. So in the HFE Act, Section 3, bracket 2, bracket A, for those who read law, in relation to the prohibitions in connection with embryos, the Act states that no person shall place in a woman an embryo other than a permitted embryo. It then goes on to define a permitted embryo, which would include those which have not had any DNA or cells altered, but more importantly, it then goes on to define a woman as a girl from birth, which essentially means cis women. In this respect, men and trans women who have not had a uterine transplant have no prohibitions relevant to them. And if we really wanted to bring in other legislation, trans men who have had who have a gender recognition certificate could also bypass the prohibitions in the Act. Gender neutral non-binary language is not used in any UK legislation. So such people are not recognised by the law at all. So they will probably be defined by their cis identity. So again, the Act does not apply to them. And this nuance is just something I thought was worth mentioning because it might be of interest in terms of how it highlights how important wording choices can be in legislation. In most countries across the globe, human germline genome editing is either prohibited or no bespoke legislation exists in relation to it at all. If anyone is interested in the further specifics of the global policy and landscape of the technology, I have included a reference at the end of the slides to an article on the topic. Some scientists and some disability and rare disease activists, among others, are keen for the technology to be developed as a potential reproductive choice for the prevention of disease. Findings from various research studies, including my own, indicate that genome editing for the use, for such use is supported by publics. But ethicists also caution about what the development of this technology could mean for people with disease and disabilities, insofar as would the development of the technology imply that people with disease and disability are not welcome in society? One could argue that considering most societies are ableist, they are inherently unwelcoming to people who do not have typical abilities anyway. So utilising genome editing technology could actually enable people to not experience the adversities that they may otherwise face if they were to be born with a preventable genetic disease. This said, the technology could theoretically, but not realistically, be used to infer selective advantages such as increased muscle mass, height, intelligence, immune protection into humans' DNA, or to infer aesthetic characteristics, and this is often what you hear with designer babies, and that concept such as eye colour, hair colour, and skin colour into people's offspring. It could also be completely misused as bioweapons and or for bioterrorism, again, very unlikely, but theoretically possible in a very long away future. In this context, there's an obvious need to restrict applications of the technology, hence why pre-pandemic many countries were assessing the legislative stance on it. So my PhD research was very much focused on what amendments to the HFE Act could include, should the UK stance be to enable the technology as a reproductive choice for the prevention of disease. As the Act was pioneering legislation for arts and gametes and embryos with human DNA outside of the human body, I assumed that amendments made to the Act would be scrutinised, globally. Hence, although my research was conducted in the UK, findings from it could potentially be utilised or built on in other countries. Findings from my research first and foremost suggest that if applications of the technology are going to be robustly restricted to preventing disease, then comprehensive definitions of disease enhancement are needed in legislation, because they're currently missing. However, data from my research also suggests that while many people are supportive of the technology being developed, few would really be willing to actually use it, even hypothetically. In this regard, whether investments into developing the technology for use as a reproductive choice is worth the expense may also really need to be considered. Nonetheless, support for the technology is dependent on three precursory factors. First, that the technology is robustly regulated to limit its potential applications to preventing disease, hence the need for the definition. Second, that scientific concerns surrounding human germline genome editing technologies are resolved before the technology is approved for use, progress of which has seemingly been stunted by the pandemic restrictions, insofar as scientists weren't allowed into labs, etc. And third, that should the technology become possible as a reproductive option, that there's equitable access to it. Whether equitable access could ever be achieved is perhaps an ethical, political, and economic minefield of its own, and it's something that, like most arts, would probably differ across countries too. So far, I've mentioned several ethical considerations, namely, what the development and the use of this technology infers to the value of people with disease and disability, i.e. the expressivist objection, insofar as it could devalue those people. And then equitable access to the technology, if it's legalised as a reproductive choice. But there are also other issues that are often mentioned in debates on this technology as well. There are potential issues with consent and long-term monitoring of people who are born following the utilisation of the technology. It sort of raises questions such as, would enforcing long-term surveillance be ethical? How would such surveillance make people feel? Also, the individual with the edited genome would never have consented to the intervention, so they may not be inclined to follow through on decisions made on their behalf long before they were born. Increasingly, the rarity of a disorder, increasing the rarity of the disorder might reduce support available for individuals and their families as well. That may mean that the increase may lead to an increase of marginalisation and stigmatisation of people living with genetic disorders and families who choose not to use them. Nonetheless, overall, ethicists have suggested that the development and application of the technology should be for the greater benefit of individuals born as a result of its use, by outweighing the potential risks, provided that the rights and well-being of the individual are protected. This essentially translates to the technology only being used to prevent serious diseases, and that the development and the use of technology should not increase disadvantage, discrimination, or division of people living with genetic disease. But none of these considerations are particularly bespoke to the technology and have previously been raised in debates in other arts, such as prenatal genetic testing and mitochondrial transfer. All the background cover then, sort of how has COVID-19, the various lockdowns and the pandemic as a whole affected the technology then? First and foremost, the pandemic has basically halted its progress, as I mentioned at the beginning. Before the pandemic, there was so much wind about scientists in Russia wanting to prematurely use the technology again on human embryos. And every other month, there were articles being published on better scientific techniques that could potentially secure the efficacy of the technology and thereby its safety, leading us one step closer to potentially actually utilising the technology with arts. But as with many other non-essential activity during the height of the pandemic, there was an eerie silence on anything to do with the technology across the board. Consequently, all other, further international initiatives which were being planned were also silenced. Discussions on amending legislation were understandably halted and are yet to even be reconvened. All the hype that surrounded the news when it was released in November 2018 has sort of evaporated, and I think the pandemic, it was all just lost during it, and the ongoing uncertainty of the pandemic has opened the door for new perspectives, really. As a result, the development and potential access to the technology is yet to be, it is yet to substantially arrive back on anyone's agendas in terms of legislation and policy. But now that the world, or at least parts of the world, are trying to adopt a new normal, perhaps development and discussions will reconvene soon. I'd also say that from a wider perspective, the pandemic created an opportunity for us all to slow down and reflect on our priorities and research, particularly the ethical issues that surround disease and disability and the conditions that it's aiming to prevent. And I know in the UK, a lot of the Ivy clinics suspended much of their activities, which obviously meant that the use of arts here plummeted, and transnational care to access various arts was also impacted. But again, that's picking up. So yeah, the pandemic did have and still has lingering impacts on this technology. But speaking towards the future, over the past weeks, I've been thinking really hard on one of the questions that the Lincoln Alexander School of Law has repeatedly been tagging me in on Twitter, to promote this event. And it was a question of how should lawmakers consider opportunities to arts when responding to COVID and future pandemics? And I thought it was a really interesting question. And I would be lying if I was to suggest that I've reached any form of a substantial answer, really. I don't think there's any clear-cut route forward on how law policymakers should consider opportunities to arts in global crises when masses of the global population are being infected with disease, which may or may not have effective treatment or cures in the hypothetical situation, certainly at the start of this COVID-19 pandemic, obviously we had no clue how to tackle it, and then we were waiting for the vaccines to be developed, etc. And I think it's true that indeed life must go on, even in such scenarios, but life can also be vastly altered, as we've all witnessed. And I don't know whether trying to create a child would remain at the top of anyone's list when trying to respond in the initial phase of a pandemic. It may be easier to forget now that we're returning to some form of, normalcy, but thinking back to initial responses when, in the UK at least, we were not able to leave our homes. We didn't know if we'd have access to food or toilet paper, so people were stockpiling. All the supermarket shelves were empty. People's financial security was shadowed with insecurity. People had to watch their loved ones die alone, or say buy over a phone call if they were even given the opportunity. In such situations, past, present, or future, I cannot envisage someone turning around and saying that, going to get a hormone injection or have their eggs extracted or an embryo transferred, etc., takes precedence. Maybe in that light, then, I don't know, my stance is that when responding to COVID and future pandemics, opportunity to art should respectfully and safely obviously be suspended, perhaps, insofar as women mid-hormone cycle should be able to complete them and then have their eggs or embryos frozen until a pandemic settles, or we reach this sort of stage where we're at now, where we can return to more pre-pandemic practices, but no new journey should really be embarked upon until a safer time, perhaps. I would be interested in hearing what people who were accessing arts and people who wanted to access arts during the pandemic think, though, before really settling on any substantial opinion. And I'm sorry to sort of end on a not so light stance, but pandemics are not a particularly light subject, so hopefully that can be excused, and I shall look forward to hearing your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amarpreet. This is now the opportunity where people who are in the audience can ask questions to either Srishti, Amarpreet, or Alison. So please feel free to put those into the Q&A. I'll give people a minute to do so. In the meantime, I did get one message. This is a question for Alison. Alison, the question says, you mentioned that Cindy Wasser reported an increase in the number of international intended parents she worked with in 2020, but I wonder if these intended parents were able to actually pursue surrogacy in that year. I ask that because CFAS's data about the number of IVF cycles involving gestational surrogacy that year were roughly half the number they were in prior years. 457 cycles rather than 845, or at least surrogacy that involved the use of IVF. So I wonder if in your research and reporting, if you've heard anything about potential obstacles to intended parents in Canada or from abroad actually receiving medical treatment that year and being able to pursue surrogacy.
Well, I mean, that's a great question because I have not verified the numbers I got. I would say I did not report on what was happening from the parental point of view. So I really, I can't really say. I think it's certainly possible that the number of surrogacies was not as high as the number of people who signed up for surrogacy. But I do think, and I have sort of in following surrogacy in other countries since, I am hearing a lot about how Canada is increasingly known as the place to go. So, but I'm sorry, I don't actually have a lot more to add to the numbers. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Alison. Let me so we don't have any in the Q&A for now, so I'll go ahead. Actually, I have a question for the panelists, and maybe all three of you can speak to this. So as I was listening to each of your wonderful thoughts, one thing that kept kind of coming to mind was this theme of overcoming barriers and the kind of interesting ways that scientists and intended parents and people who are working on artificial womb technology, who are working on international surrogacy, or who are working on germline editing technologies, or patients who are engaging with these technologies, are all finding kind of creative ways to overcome the barriers that have been created by the pandemic, whether those are policy and legislative barriers or otherwise. I think specifically, Alison, I was coming back to you talking about the creativity with which people found ways to cross borders. So I guess as a general theme to all panelists, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how people, non-policymakers, scientists, or people who are using these technologies find ways to engage with these technologies even when legislative barriers are put in place. So I will invite whoever would like to speak first.
Sorry.
Go for it, Srishti.
So I think this question probably least applies to me, so I'll give a short response and then give Amarpreet and Alison a chance to respond. I think what's important to keep in mind with regards to artificial womb technology is that scientists are continuing to push boundaries within the legislative limits that exist. So the experimentation on both ends of the spectrum in terms of partial ectogenesis and embryo research hasn't stopped, which I think is exciting. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the international body that is the sort of preeminent body, the ISSCR, on stem cell research 6 months ago made a huge change by relaxing the rules around the 14-day rule that exists. And so now they're basically saying we're willing to consider experimentation on a case-by-case basis, and we will continue to explore the sort of paradigms or ethical principles that ground the decisions that we make and the research that we allow. So, I think the legislation and regulations, from my perspective, were created in a different era with consultations with folks that are no longer around and don't, I think, don't necessarily see the full impact of things like IVF and the acceptance of reproductive technologies in society. And so I think we really need to go back to the drawing board and think about what were the premises under which we made the rules, and how can we overcome, from my perspective, the barriers that they've created.
Thanks, Srishti. I think that's a great answer. Amarpreet.
I think using the term Marsha Inhorn sort of coined of repro travel, I think that's one way most people accessing art sort of evade legislation and policy in their own country of residence. They travel elsewhere, access what technology they want under the circumstances that they want it, and then travel back having received that care as a way to evade restrictions that exist there. That is a huge industry. It's a multi-million, if not billion-pound industry, repro travel, and it just continues to grow. And I cannot see that stopping. So even say if genome editing, for example, were to be legalized in China or America as opposed to the UK, there's nothing stopping citizens from anywhere traveling to those, and that's when they become destinations for repro travel. You get hotspots for surrogacy, etc., because it's legal there in a different context. So people will travel there where it's legal because they want to achieve their reproductive desires. And I think there's no real way to stop that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, and maybe Alison, you want to speak to this, but I think your research is really showing that people are going to travel for these things, irrespective of what kinds of legislative boundaries are being created. So perhaps you have more to say on that.
I guess I would just say that I think I remain a very naive person, because I just expected, for some reason, if you recall, in Canada during that first spring, fertility clinics did close. Not in the US, all of them, but a lot of them in Canada did close. Mm-hmm. I don't know why I expected that there would be pressure on fertility clinics not to initiate pregnancies, especially not surrogate pregnancies for overseas clients. I don't know where I thought that guidance would come from or how it would happen. I just thought it would follow. And I certainly have never heard anyone say that that was the case, that they were discouraged from starting new cycles, or even for people who were going to have some challenge coming in and out, or for uncertainty at least. So I'm kind of naive, and I remain naive. I'm just going to say that I'm equally naive today when I hear that with the war in Ukraine, it's not like people are saying, hey, Ukrainian surrogates shouldn't be starting cycles. In fact, they're saying, how do we start the cycles? So I'm more surprised by the lack of restrictions that were placed on the industry than I am by the creativity that they used to find ways out of the problems that emerged. There were fewer problems than I expected, because I really thought there would be. I don't know why I thought this. I just thought you wouldn't be allowed to do it, but so.
Amarpreet, do you have a response to that?
It's not a sort of response to that, but it just made me think that, in it sort of acts as a barrier, these arbitrary restrictions in various countries, and it can in many ways then exacerbate inequalities that exist in terms of who can repro travel really. So the affluent will always be able to, they can hop on a plane, etc., and go and achieve their reproductive desires, whilst it'll be the people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds that are really disadvantaged and may not be able to afford that luxury, or as it sounds like I'm a cheerleader for Professor Inhorn's work here. They might put themselves into debts and remortgage their houses and go through all sorts of financial difficulties to achieve that dream that they have. So yeah, those restrictions can just create further marginalizations and exacerbate discriminations, etc.
I have a few questions coming in through the Q&A and also through the chat. So I have one directed to Srishti, and it is legislative reform in Canada on assisted human reproduction has often been quite slow. What steps or strategies are needed for there to be law reform which would permit the development of new assisted reproductive technologies in Canada?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So which would permit the development of new assisted reproductive technologies in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think part of my rationale for doing the research that I'm doing is exactly to give policymakers and legislators access to qualitative data on people's perspectives across Canada and Australia on legislative reform when it comes to assisted reproductive technologies, both on the issues that I talked about, but also what Amarpreet mentioned in terms of again, this is my bias, but the language in both the HFEA and the Act in Canada, which is fundamentally discriminatory if we look at the Canadian Charter of Human Rights on grounds of sex or gender. And so I think we need to do this kind of research. We need to publish this kind of research. We need to make it available to people who are in positions, considering these kinds of things. But I think also that we need to continue to empower those who are focused on science and technology to really be the ones who are able to shape these conversations. I think from my reading, from my understanding in the past, when things like the 14-day rule were established, there was a bit of a negotiation in terms of what people's beliefs are around conception. At what point should we be, quote unquote, intervening with natural human processes? And I think what we need is a real recognition that we already do. We already intervene systematically in pregnancy. And part of the reason why we intervene in that process is because people die otherwise. And so, I hope that some of the statistics that I provided are things that take, together can really make a better story for why Canada can actually be a destination for emerging technologies rather than things like surrogacy, which may have some components of exploitation inherently built into it because it uses the reproductive labor of other human beings to realize somebody's desires. So I hope that answers the question, but I think we need to do further research. We need to have conversations with folks in positions of power about, what is happening and do a better job translating the science to the possible, not only population health impacts, but then also, impacts on the human condition from the anthro lens.
Absolutely. The questions are pouring in, so I'm going to get to those that I can before we run out of time. The next one that I'm seeing is directed at Alison. It says, while you mentioned that Canada has reasonable laws for international surrogacy, are there legal issues as fertility medicine interacts with other aspects of the healthcare system?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
I think the question is directed at whether some of the legal issues that are related specifically to fertility medicine interact specifically with the any laws that are related to the healthcare system kind of more generally.
I'm so sorry. I don't think I understand what the question is. I mean, for the fertility industry and surrogacy industry is governed by the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, which allows and forbids certain things. But I'm not sure what the question is with respect to with respect to. Sorry if I'm missing the point.
If I could,
Of
I
course,
think,
yeah.
one of the things that we could consider is beyond sort of surrogacy, reproductive travel that is done. I think like in BC, there's a huge number of folks that travel from other parts of the world to make sure that their kids are born, in the country for citizenship and other things. So I think, that has the unintended impact that citizens of BC, of Canada, aren't necessarily able to access the services quite as directly or as quickly as others who are engaging in reproductive tourism or travel or trying to look at, acquiring citizenship through where their kids are born. That might just be one example.
I mean, I suppose one thing I could add is that, of course, if you have a child, if someone has a child that ends up in the NICU, and you don't, and somehow it isn't a child that has some kind of insurance, then Canada will cover the cost, which can be substantial, can be in up to around $100,000 for a premature birth that needs a lot of care. Also, I think one of the things that interests me is to what extent does fertility care, which is largely private, sort of piggyback on our public system? I guess that's a question I wish could be answered. How many of the tests, I don't have access to this information, but I'd like someone to find out how many of the tests that are asked for by a fertility doctor are actually covered by, say, OHIP, or when a woman has ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, what does that cost OHIP? Because it's a private medical care that ends up in a public hospital, but I'm not sure if that was what was being asked about.
No, I think those are both very good answers that relate quite well to the question that is being asked. I'm conscious of the fact that we are running out of time, so I'm just going to answer one more of the question, and I apologize to everyone asking questions that we can't get to all of them. But I'm just going to end on a last question, which is, as we think about the future post-pandemic, how should we think about how to approach legal governance of reproductive technologies, be it artificial womb technology, surrogacy, germline editing technology, etc.? So this is perhaps one that a number of you can speak to, but just again, being conscious of time, maybe keep your answers a little on the shorter end of things. Srishti, would you like to go first?
Sure. Sorry, I was hoping somebody else would jump in so I wasn't occupying too much airtime. So I think ultimately reproductive governance is something that we really need to think about. And the best way to think about it from my perspective is to do effective research. So I think qualitative research opens up the door for, those exploratory questions in principle. And then I think that needs to be followed up with quantitative research on, yes, fair enough, the 526 folks who participated in my study, probably identified in a certain way, were from a certain demographic, et cetera. So they had a specific perspective, but more broadly, I think we need widespread consultations with the public that help to inform reproductive governance structures.
Any last comments, Alison or Amarpreet, or both?
I mean, what I would say, I guess, is where surrogacy is concerned, at least, is I'm not opposed to Canada being a place where people come to do international surrogacy, especially if we make it possible for gay dads, for instance, to have children where they can't do it in their home country and so on. I think we're a safe and good, we're a good country, technologically advanced, medically advanced, and so on. Problem is, I think, that we face here is that what our international surrogacy sector is actually edging out Canadians who need surrogacy, unfortunately. And that's partly, I think, because it's easier for international couples to get around our laws than it is for Canadians to abide by our laws and get surrogates. And I think that's something we need to address, that and the cost of producing children for people who live outside of the country. I think that's something we should also address.
Amarpreet, any last words that you'd like to add there?
I'm not thinking about cover everything. I was just replying to past questions in the chat. So the person had it answered.
I apologize. Somebody asked a question about women's bodies and the commodification of women's bodies as it relates to, surrogacy and other assisted reproductive technologies. I apologize. I didn't answer that. I was hoping to answer it via a typed out answer, but I think that's a critical part, and I think we need to stretch it to not just women's bodies, but human bodies and the impact of things like surrogacy, and Canada being a leader in that, and consider whether there might be other technological solutions like the artificial womb that don't result in commodification.
In the sake of time, I'm going to end our discussion there, but I wanted to say thank you so much to Ottawa Youth Centre for Health Law, Policy and Ethics for co-hosting this event with the research group on health law and innovation at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law. I hope for many future collaborative events, but more importantly, I want to thank Amarpreet, Alison, and Srishti for your wonderful talks. You've given us all, I think, a lot to think about. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of this in Toronto very gray day today. Thanks so much.